So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nancy Heller.
Hi there. I wanted to thank Abby, obviously, for that lovely introduction, and thank you folks for coming out on what is maybe not the most beautiful day we've ever had, actually, in Philadelphia. So thank you. My topic, as you know, and as you can see here, is the art of Liza Lou, a 50-year-old American sculptor whose work, no less an authority than Peter Schjeldahl, who's the art critic of the New Yorker magazine, has described as... Yes, he has described her work as, quote, crystallized rapture, cheeky jazzy scintillation, and, as you can see, pure wonder. The question is, well, what drove the generally serious Mr. Schjeldahl to extend such extravagant praise was, as you may know, actually were, two large sculptural installations from the 1990s that made Liza Lou famous. And the first of these was that, a full-sized kitchen in which every single surface of every single object is completely encrusted with colorful, shiny glass beads, cleverly called the kitchen, from 1991-96. The first reaction of many people who've seen this work is kind of sheer open-mouth amazement, because it's a little bit difficult to believe that you're seeing what you're seeing, even though the individual parts of her kitchen are obviously quite clear. But let's face it, how often does anybody encounter bead-covered floors, walls, curtains, kitchen cabinets, a table and chair, a tablecloth, a refrigerator, a stove, and everything else that Americans generally associate with the idea of a kitchen, transformed through Ms. Lou's artistry into bead-covered everything from cereal boxes and muffins and a milk carton and a newspaper to all kinds of other things like mixers, handheld mixers, and even a bead-covered pie in the oven, or for that matter, my favorite, beaded water in the sink where you have beaded dirty dishes. And just not to be outdone, as you can perhaps see over there, you have a dust whips, you have a dustpan in which you have beaded balls of dust. As we all do. So there we go. Whatever else you may think about kitchen, really it's kind of an extraordinary achievement in terms of both technique and its size. And by the way, short advertisement, through January of 2021, there is a rare opportunity to see this artwork in person, which I think is really especially important for her work. Because at the moment it's on the 6th floor of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City, where it's part of a special exhibition of artworks involving, let's just say, craft-like elements. Kitchen is in the Whitney Museum's permanent collection, but because of its size, it's not on display very often. So speaking of size, how big is it, you ask? I answer, kitchen covers 168 square feet, more or less like an actual suburban American kitchen from the late 20th century, say. And it is literally made up of millions of colored glass beads, individually applied by hand solely by Liza Lou. She said in many interviews that she initially estimated it would take her 3 months to do this. In the end, it took 5 years. At the Whitney, visitors can see the richness and radiance of kitchen. They can also see that it's like a stage set, which I wasn't really clear about till I saw it for the first time recently. It is, in fact, a 3-sided mock-up of an actual kitchen. So you can walk around one side, and you can see that it does have, sort of unadorned plywood walls. You can also look in through the window and see what's going on inside the kitchen. So I think it's probably time to say something about this artist. So the artist who created a kitchen, obviously, is this person, Liza Lou. Now, some of the details of Liza Lou's early life remain, shall we say, a bit fuzzy. There's some contradictory and vague information, but there are some basic facts that I think are pretty definitely true. And they appear to be these. She and her older sister were born in New York City, reportedly to folks who are often described as bohemian parents, who were part, shall we say, of that era's lively literary and visual arts scene. At some point early in the girls' lives, their parents experienced kind of a religious transformation, really, becoming charismatic Christians, or as we sometimes say, born-again Christians. And supposedly one result of that was that they had to renounce, or they felt they had to renounce, practically every aspect of their lives. So they supposedly burned a Roy Lichtenstein painting that they owned, they discarded their collection of books, and generally, again, decided that they, literally had to get rid of everything from their former lives. Liza Lou's parents divorced when she was 5 years old. She and her sister moved to Minneapolis, where they lived with their mother. Liza Lou, was estranged from her father for many, many decades, and as you probably guessed, Lou is not her original last name, but I have not been able to find anywhere what it was, so she's Liza Lou. In Minnesota, Lou says, she was raised with a very strong fundamentalist Christian faith and a very strict sense of discipline. And the discipline definitely was useful for her as a grown-up. She said her mother maintained, the comment was, if you're awake, you should be doing something useful. So Liza Lou has always done things that were at least useful for her art. She also grew up apparently, and I just say this because it's unusual to me, but she grew up like a lot of charismatic Christians, apparently, witnessing exorcisms and people speaking in tongues and things which to a number of us, I have to say to me, just seem kind of remarkable because I have not experienced them. She also had a lot of early exposure to cultural resources because she was in Minneapolis. So that included seeing museums like the Walker Art Center. And she says often that by the time she was 8 years old, Liza Lou was sure she was going to become an artist, which of course she did. In 1979, when she was about 10, her family moved to Southern California, and after a few sort of false post-high school starts, when she was 18, she won a scholarship to attend the San Francisco Art Institute, and there she had intended to become a painter. But one sort of critical experience apparently changed that plan and really shaped the rest of her professional life. A friend, she says, took her to a bead store, not that one, but a bead store. The kind of place where people who are interested in quotation mark crafts would go to buy materials, to make jewelry, etc. There's a great one at Chestnut and, about 20th, I guess? Anyway, so people would often go there, and her friend took her there, and she said, keeping in mind that in those days, crafts versus fine arts, they were regarded as completely different animals. In any case, faced with these amazing, colorful, glistening beads, Liza Lou said she basically fell in love with the whole idea of glass beads. So back at school, she began incorporating beads into her paintings, which, today would be kind of normal because a lot of highly valued artists do that. Just to pick a couple of examples, perhaps Elaine Thomas, who in works like this diptych, if we get close up, certainly regularly applies beads and rhinestones and all kinds of other shiny decorations to her panels, and nowadays that's not unusual. Likewise, Nick Cave with his famous sound suits, which that is an example of. He makes pieces that, they remind me of ecclesiastical garments, just absolutely covered with gorgeous, highly decorated, ornamented surfaces, which he uses for performance art, but also to display here. And by the way, I'm advertising everybody but PAFA, sorry. I will advertise PAFA in a minute. But just to point it out, in case you're not aware, which you probably are, through January 12th, 2020, you of course can see those two artworks I just showed you by Elaine Thomas and Nick Cave, and of course lots of other ones, in the Barnes Foundation Museum's exhibition, 30 Americans. And that exhibition, as you probably know, features exclusively works by African Americans, but of course lots of artists of various racial and ethnic backgrounds, including Liza Lou, are also celebrated these days for using shiny objects in their work. But we're talking about when Liza Lou started adding the beads to her paintings. And back in the 1980s, in the US art world, I think it's fair to say people on the whole were not generally comfortable with the notion of contemporary, homegrown fine art that sparkled and shined. That wasn't supposed to do that. And even today, in this country, in my experience, there are people certainly who still tend to associate beads, rhinestones, sequins, and so on, with little girls' holiday party dresses or the bedazzled cell phone cases that I tend to see around town, especially in the hands of usually younger people. Certainly, it's true that you see gem-encrusted handbags by somebody like Judith Leiber, which are covered in, as I say, colorful, shiny materials, and they certainly sell for extravagant sums. But I think it's still fair to say most people would call them, if you have to call them something, haute couture accessories, for high-end design maybe, rather than sculpture, although you could argue that they are. But in any case, in 2007, to use another example, sorry, I had to throw that in there. You probably know that in 2007, the former young British artist Damien Hirst, he's still a British artist, he's just not as young, who is, anyway. He, of course, covered a platinum cast of a human skull with 8,601 real diamonds, precisely, at least in part, to ask the question, exactly how tasteless and how outrageous does an object have to be not to qualify as art? You may know, though, that apparently his skull definitely was considered art by a lot of people because it sold in 2007 from his London gallery to an investment group, reportedly for $100 million. Yes, but back to the kitchen and back to Liza Lou. The point is that for a long time, American art historians, art critics, and lots of artists and collectors were profoundly suspicious of the whole idea of beauty. I mean, when I was in graduate school in the 70s, you weren't supposed to admit it if you really liked something that was beautiful. That was not considered, an appropriate response. It wasn't serious, right? Because especially if an artwork was colorful and shiny, a lot of people did believe, and still do, but used to believe much more, it obviously couldn't have any intellectual significance or any deeper emotional meaning or any real importance, in other words. And the catch is, that's what Liza Lou kept finding when she was at the San Francisco Art Institute, was people kept saying, what are you doing? Adding beads to your paintings. And she felt that she was so discouraged about this and taken so completely not seriously that after a couple of months she dropped out and went on to do this. Now, a piece like Kitchen, some people say, is kind of too pretty, too decorative, too superficial to be taken seriously, and many people are concerned, or certainly were, that it was too full of childlike joy and sensual pleasure, which I personally think are both fine things. Nevertheless, they weren't, full of anti-essentialist theory or what have you, and therefore, again, it shouldn't be taken seriously as art. Of course, for many other viewers, including myself, it's precisely the joyful, sensual pleasure that a sculptural installation like this can convey that makes it so wonderful. And obviously the curators at the Whitney Museum, which now owns it, think this too, and think that it is important. The other thing is, if you are concerned, and I understand that we all are, that perhaps there should be something beside or behind or beneath that rather gorgeous, bedazzled surface, I just want to point out, as many people have done before me, there actually is a lot more to Kitchen than meets the eye. For one thing, there's just the process used in creating it. That's obviously an old photograph of Liza Lou with short hair, creating Kitchen. And as she has explained in countless interviews, Liza Lou was herself bedazzled by a summer trip she took as a young person to Italy. She said she just reveled in the complex colors and patterns and gold-accented religious mosaics and domes and so on that she saw in a lot of the cathedrals there. Back home, in her mother's San Diego kitchen, Liza Lou said she had an epiphany. She decided to bead the kitchen. Now, not literally her mother's kitchen, because her mother used it, but actually a version of her mother's kitchen. So, in 1990, she married her childhood sweetheart, the musician Eric Smith, and the young couple moved through a series of loft apartments and, endured, as you would imagine, major financial struggles while he was going to school and she was working, as a waitress, doing various other odd jobs, and trying to create Kitchen with absolutely zero institutional support of any kind, no assistance, just her. Lou found an old refrigerator and an equally ancient stove abandoned on the street. She cleaned them out. She started covering them with beads. Then the 1994 California earthquake destroyed her studio. She apparently had 2 hours to evacuate. And she also, perhaps more significantly for her, got divorced that same year. But Liza Lou kept beading, and she kept working on Kitchen, working at it for 18-hour days when she wasn't doing odd jobs like waitressing, selling prom dresses, etc. The result, as she has often pointed out, was pretty terrible physically. She got terrible tendinitis in both hands, couldn't hold a pencil for a long time after finishing this work. She had problems with her back, problems with her knees, and virtual malnutrition because she had very little money and no time to do things like eating. One way that she survived during this period was by making and selling small, portable beaded objects, like, for example, life-size beaded underwear, especially socks, and shoes and other items. And here comes the PAFA comment, including this, which is owned by this very museum. Untitled yellow panties with tiny light blue polka dots from 1994, which is a life-size pair of not really very wearable, I mean, I suppose you could, but not really, panties, which myself I think is first of all hysterical, and second of all surprisingly seductive. Unfortunately, it's not on view right now, but it has been, and when you get a chance to see it for real, it's, I think, very clever and very intriguing, as is another piece also owned by PAFA, the Untitled Spoon from 1992, made up of gold beads and rhinestones. Luckily, there was a photo, not the photo we just saw, but a photo postcard that Liza Lou made up, and it sounds like almost on a whim, sent to the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York City. And it attracted the attention of that museum's powerful director and curator, Marcia Tucker, who put it into a group show the very same year that it was completed, 1996. And in another stroke of luck, in 1997, Kitchen was purchased by Peter and Eileen Norton, and the proceeds from that sale were what enabled Lou to devote herself to her second major installation, and of course it also made her quite famous. Before we go, though, to that work, I just want to look a little more closely with you at a couple of other aspects about Kitchen. Over the decades, Lou has said various, sometimes contradictory things, frankly, about this piece. Writers have also interpreted it in different ways, and she says she always welcomes individual people's individual, divergent interpretations of her work, so there's no one right way, to look at it, to experience it. But according to the artist, at least initially, at least she says this sometimes, Kitchen, she says, was never meant as some sort of feminist screed about how housewives are often kind of imprisoned within their own kitchens, constantly doing and redoing a lot of backbreaking, endless work. Cooking and cleaning isn't always a lot of fun. It's kind of like what Robert Frost described in his 1914 poem, A Servant to Servants, as, quote, doing things over and over that just won't stay done, unquote. In the poem, the woman's talking about cooking for a whole lot of ranch hands and making beds and, all those kinds of things. Rather, Liza Lou says she intended Kitchen as a way to celebrate and honor the labor of housewives, whose work, no surprise, is usually ignored and unappreciated, she felt. So, I would still call it feminist in that sense, though it's hardly a conventional feminist artwork. Of course, it's hardly a conventional anything, really. A few other details I just wanted to mention. Liza Lou loves to point out that she literally beaded every surface in this sculpture, and by that she means including the insides of the cereal boxes, the undersides of the cereal bowls, things that nobody else will ever see. But she knows they're there and she knows they're beaded. So it's an example, if you look at it that way, perhaps as the thoroughness of her obsession, because some people do see the work she did for 5 years on Kitchen as perhaps a not altogether healthy obsession. There are other people who say, well, but it wouldn't have been done otherwise, and a lot of artists left to their own devices probably would work exclusively on their art until they develop tendinitis. Not a good thing, but it does happen sometimes. Anyway, it may also be, which seems to me more likely, a reflection of her religious upbringing, because she often pointed out that she was taught that it was very important to believe in and respect things that were unseen as well as things that were seen. Now, I don't think the religion said anything about the undersides of beaded cereal bowls, but the principle, I think is perhaps the same. There are also a few kind of self-conscious, maybe, references to political issues here. If you can look on the left there, at that pie in the oven, you can see there are some sort of naughty nudies there in the back of the oven, which of course can be interpreted lots of different ways. And on the right, on the bottom, which is really the inside, right, of the open door to the oven, you have, it's a little hard to see here, but you have the logo of Aunt Jemima, of course, a very popular brand for a long time in this country, but also something which, especially these days, we tend to see as not an altogether positive use of a certain stereotype. And there also, there also is, wrong button, there also is right here her signature, which is kind of nice. Anyway, there also are elements such as this in kitchen. If you look at this part, which I used to think was a tea towel, and now I'm not quite sure what it is. But whatever it is, it's some sort of hanging fabric-like thing on the near edge of that kitchen counter. And it, of course, includes images, as I hope you can see a little bit. But it also includes a beaded poem by Emily Dickinson discussing the proper way for a married woman to comport herself. And that poem begins, quote, "She rose to his requirement, dropped the playthings of her life to take the honorable work of woman and of wife," unquote. And I think this sentiment, in a way, strikes me as being a bit disconcerting amid all this sort of shininess and color. And keep in mind that Liza Lou was 20 years old when she began working on this project. And I should point out, my reference to Frost and her reference here to Dickinson are pretty typical. She has always apparently loved poetry. She often quotes it in her writings. And when she gives artist talks, she also often quotes poetry and also reads from her diary, which is very moving and I think also surprisingly poetic. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that kitchen, in addition to its purely visual, superficial aspects, actually does have kind of a lot to say about a variety of issues. And moreover, as several authors have pointed out, this first major piece by Liza Lou already incorporates many of the major themes that recur really throughout her subsequent work. Themes like imprisonment, sensuality, repetition, the use of a grid. Liza Lou's second major installation, as it says right there, which I mentioned before, she was able to start really because of the financial success involved with kitchen, is an equally breathtaking and equally complicated piece, Backyard, from 1996 to 1999. Now, it's similar to kitchen in the sense that it's a large installation, that it's seductive and glittery and colorful, and some of it is laugh out loud funny, and it's also strangely disturbing, at least I think so. It is a faithful three-dimensional replica, and depending on how you look at it, a celebration or possibly a criticism, or maybe it's a celebration and a criticism of, the iconic American backyard barbecue. Some writers view this as the, quote, masculine, unquote, counterpart to kitchen, since after all, stereotypically, it's the American man who grills the burgers in the backyard, right? So the woman's in the kitchen and he's outside. In any case, this is 525 square feet of colored glass beads from the Czech Republic, by the way, which was long famous for its beads, although nowadays Liza Lou actually custom orders her beads from Japan. So in this case, you have beaded versions, which I hope you can see, of everything from the grill, obviously, to a picnic table and benches, a checkered tablecloth, food on that tablecloth, a laundry basket, laundry hanging on the clothesline, pink flamingos, a watering can, a garden hose, a tree, lots of flowers, and especially all that grass. And although she had always worked alone before, at this point, when she started Backyard, Liza Lou realized, she timed herself working on some of it, and she thought, no, it would take at least 100 years for her to finish this by herself. So she had really to do something else. So she basically used her newfound fame as a way to attract interest and get myriad volunteers to come and attend what she called lawn parties, which were places where people got together to actually make specifically those grass blades, because you realize those are individual blades of grass, individually made by putting bead by bead by bead on each wire by each person. So the deal is those are 4-inch wires. You start by crimping the end with tiny, tiny pliers. You slip on a round bead to simulate a drop of dew, and then you use cylindrical beads, which she'd already pre-sorted by color, because again, she's nothing if not, careful and systematic. And you fill the wire, and then you crimp the other end to keep the beads in place. Takes a while. That New Yorker art critic I mentioned earlier, Peter Sheldall, was one of Lou's many volunteer grassmakers, and he was so besotted with the whole enterprise that he actually contributed the lead essay to the 2011 monograph about Lou that's mentioned on your handout, extolling the superior of the 21 blades that he was so proud he had created. Just to show you a little more specifically, you have your beaded sandwich, your lawnmower, your watering can, your garden hose, complete, of course, with beaded water trickling out of it, because you know you never can really get them to stop. Your beaded flowers, of which there are many. Beaded bugs on the beaded leaves. And then again, that just amazing, amazing grass, which is really quite extraordinary. Here is a photograph. It's one of the few times I could find an example of a place which was big enough to be devoted to showing both kitchen and backyard together, so you get some sense of the relative size here. But going back to backyard, it may be, some people see it as, an indictment of soulless American suburban life and the hopelessly macho idea that a lot of men in America feel they're obliged, to follow. But as Peter Sheldall advised, he says, don't try too hard to analyze Lou's work. She tells us not to do so. Instead, he says, quote, open yourself up to the lovely, transcending humor of a work like this. Which, after all, is a lot of fun, and I do think fun is more important than critics tend to give it credit for. Backyard, of course, also marked the start of Liza Lou's experience collaborating with other people, so it only took 3 years. Sorry. And by the time she'd finished Backyard, Lou, who was by then 30 years old, not surprisingly, decided that, well, maybe she would try something a little different. So the subjects and the moods, really, of her work changed. In some ways, a lot of her work became darker in mood, etc., and sometimes in color. And in several cases, it definitely became stranger. One interesting example is Trailer from 1998-2000. You see it here in an exhibition with 2 other works, one of which I'll show you closer up in a minute. This exhibition in 2002 was called Testimony, which certainly had a religious reference there. Anyway, Trailer began as another project using a reclaimed, discarded object, in this case a 40-foot-long trailer that Lou found abandoned in the Mojave Desert, and she had it towed to her house. She gutted it and then proceeded to bead the entire interior, she said, using kind of a 1940s, 50s film noir theme as her inspiration. By the way, it turns out, I didn't know, so I was curious, it's not just any old trailer. It's not this one, but it's one like this. And it turns out that this is a 1949 Spartan mobile mansion, mind you, reconditioned vintage versions of which now sell for a whole lot of money. And that's without Liza Lou's beadwork inside. Anyway, as Lou has oftenly noted, it's also kind of ironic that in this period when the actual trailer was made, in 1949, a trailer was kind of a symbol for many Americans of, freedom, and in this case, luxury. Although these days, unfortunately, when people talk about living in a trailer, it tends to have rather different and less positive associations. In any case, Liza Lou decided to follow the classic movie idea by limiting her palette in trailer to mainly black, white, and shades of gray and blue. So that's an interior view of what she did. She has everything from faux beaded wood paneling on the walls and built-in furniture to references to, again, kind of a certain kind of stereotypical hard-bitten American man, So inside she has a beaded man's magazine, a beaded gun owner's magazine, a typewriter, a gun, a rifle, a knife, several references to deer hunting, a bottle of whiskey, a package of cigarettes, a camera, a guitar, and several kind of tacky-looking lamps, plus a pair of men's boots, and ominously a single beaded human leg. So you can see some of the things here. And the leg is not explained. There she is, in case you can't see it easily, sort of sitting there to give you a sense. It is a life-size trailer because it is a trailer. So the leg thing, again, not explained, but obviously certain sinister elements come to mind, and it certainly seems to imply some references, as she once said, to violence and sin. And you can apparently actually walk inside this sculpture. I wasn't able to figure out where it is, so I don't know, and I can't tell you how to walk inside it, but apparently you can. And also there's sound as part of the installation from an actual film noir playing on, of course, a beaded television of men arguing to sort of exacerbate or add to, you know, that feeling of dread, perhaps. In 2002, Liza Lou won an important award from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, one of their so-called genius grants. In addition to greatly increasing her publicity and prestige, obviously, this grant also brought with it a substantial amount of money, which freed the artist to continue exploring various new approaches to her work. And for a period there, religion, which obviously had been a part of her life, her whole life, but beginning in the early 2000s, religion became, it seems to me, an important subject for a lot of her large figurative sculptures. By then, she had been a practicing Buddhist for some years, but her background as a charismatic Christian clearly is always there in her, I'm sure, but also in a lot of her works, and it started to be expressed more overtly at this period. And what I'm getting at are two of these works particularly, which also demonstrate her, that is Liza Lou's, interest in referring to one degree or another to works by other artists, because even though she seems as though she's very sort of closed in many ways, she clearly knows her contemporary art history. So a very interesting piece called Man from 2007, made of glass beads on cast fiberglass, which is how it's able to retain that position. So it's you know, life-size. So a life-size man in a black suit, irrationally and magically suspended in a backbend in the thin air, so it seems, with a white dove, a dove of peace, a dove of the Holy Spirit. I mean, there are plenty of doves, heaven knows, in Christianity. Appears to be, well, either issuing forth from his mouth or perhaps coming into his mouth, you know, receiving the Holy Spirit, that idea. Again, it's not explained. She says she's not big on museum texts. She doesn't want to tell you what she wants this to mean. It means what we think it means. But I do think that deadpan title, just calling it Man, is kind of interesting. And that sort of surreal, movement-filled pose reminds me, anyway, as some of us were discussing earlier, of a series of drawings and paintings by Robert Longo from his Men in the City series of drawings and paintings from the 1980s. She also made this, which I have to say I personally find kind of disturbing, and maybe I should. It's called The Damned from 2003-2004, and it obviously depicts Adam and Eve. Adam as a grotesquely muscled figure, and Eve obviously after being thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Both figures are made of obviously golden beads on cast polyester resin bodies, and each one is over 7 feet tall. So these, I haven't seen it for real, but they're obviously very large and must be very commanding presences when you see them for real. Their expressions obviously are anguished. People who write about this often compare them to, if you look on the right, to the famous anguished figures of Adam and Eve in Masaccio's 1425 fresco of the expulsion from the garden. I mean, it's not the same, but that there are certain similar aspects, obviously. Although in Liza Lou's piece, the gold color, I think, is one of the most jarring elements. And one more explicitly religious sculpture that I wanted to mention by Liza Lou that, again, at least to me, is one of the strangest, The Vessel, from 2005-2006. Now, it's a life-size kneeling figure of a man wearing a loincloth, again with the body covered in gold beads, holding aloft a large wooden beam, which, at least to me, I think is supposed to be a reference to Christ carrying the cross, except, of course, this figure doesn't have a head. And if you look at the back, the red beaded stump of his neck is actually concave, and it is like a literal vessel that could hold something. Now, that clearly, as many people have pointed out, is a reference to the Bible, to Romans 9, where it says, quote, man is a vessel of God, unquote, and that he contains the deity. But I don't think that really explains, for me, what Liza Lou is doing. And again, she says she's not trying to explain. And I should say the people I've asked about this particular piece and the writings I've consulted about this particular piece seem to find it rather less perplexing and upsetting than I do, so that may say more about me than about the piece. And I should say, Vessel was purchased in 2010 at Christie's in London for $462,399, which doesn't mean anything except that it sort of indicates how her star has risen in a certain way. I feel I should also mention this, Born Again, from 2002 or 3, which was a 50-minute solo monologue that Liza Lou performed initially in several American and European cities. And there's a DVD that it was made into. YouTube has some really short clips. So I don't know, it seems to raise more questions about Liza Lou's early life than it answers. It appears to be her describing some pretty horrific abuses of 2 little girls by their father, who was fanatically religious, but it's not at all clear to anyone, except I assume her, if any of that is actually autobiographical, and if so, how much. But it's a very strange, but interesting and arresting video, that's for sure, based on the small part I've seen. Okay. In 2005, Liza Lou made what was probably the most important change in her life and her career. She moved to Durban, a kind of gritty port city in the province of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And forgive me, but I like maps. So here we have South Africa, there you have KwaZulu-Natal, and there you have Durban. At first, this move, might sound a little bit odd from Southern California to South Africa. But as Lou describes it, it actually made complete sense. For some time, the artist said she had wanted to go work someplace where she could be of tangible help to other people, unquote. And after doing a lot of research and consulting with a number of nonprofits, she decided to go to Durban since, at that time particularly, residents of the townships in that area, who tend, of course, to be very poor, had like a 70% unemployment rate and an enormously high rate of HIV infection and all kinds of recurring problems with violence. More than that, she was certainly aware that Zulu women who were there had a very long tradition and a very extraordinary tradition of working with beads. Clearly, these kinds of beads and bead work are not the patterns or techniques that Liza Lou uses, but she felt initially she wanted to work with these people because they had a lot of skill, and she could perhaps be of help by paying them to work with her and for her, and perhaps teach her system of beadwork to folks who already had great related skills. So she kept her studio in Los Angeles, where she still had, and as far as I know still has, assistants, but she was now able to make much more ambitious works and more works in South Africa. So she rented 2 large rooms in downtown Durban, hired a team of between 30 to 50, depending on the time, people, mostly women, but there were a few men. And she discovered during the 10-year period that she lived in Durban that, no surprise, she found herself learning more about life for sure, but even about art and about beading than she taught anybody. In particular, she talks about letting go of her need to control every aspect of her work, which of course she'd done during Kitchen because she was the only person doing it. That's just a very nice photograph, I think, with Liza Lou in the middle of some of her helpers. Interestingly, when working with her team, this blonde, blue-eyed Southern California artist said she felt for the first time that she was really home. She said she felt this when she first got together with her assistants. She calls them her team. She said because, among other things, they share with her a love of singing, and singing specifically gospel songs. She'd always sung and she'd always played the guitar. So apparently they developed an hour-long ritual anytime they got together in the studio, and they would sing and dance in a circle. And you can imagine that would encourage a lot of camaraderie, among other things. And inevitably, Liza Lou also got to know her team members intimately, not just their expertise in working with beads, but their personal lives as well, which were often very difficult and marked by serious illness and violence. After a while, Lou realized that because of bus strikes and childcare issues, it was often too expensive and too slow for her assistants to come to her downtown studio. So she started commissioning sections of a given sculpture, like a band of beading, that a woman could work on at home. And that system became so successful that many of her team members eventually hired their own teams where they lived. And the money that those women earned made a very significant difference in their lives and the lives of their families. Ironically, or maybe not, the first series of artworks that Liza Lou and her Durban assistants made together concerned the theme of security. For example, this security fence from 2005, which is a real chain-link fence with real metal poles and a real set of razor wire pieces at the top, all of them covered, as you can see, with glistening silver beads. She said, when she first thought of this idea, she said she wasn't sure if it was humanly possible to wrap glass beads around those areas. And she said the more impossible something is, the more she wants to do it. So she was very clear she wanted to do it, and you can see they obviously did with some care with the razor wire. She said she was especially interested in general in details like this, where you can see where pieces come together that were particularly challenging for the process. And there really is this obvious disconnect and this obvious challenge to see something that's so horrible and so disturbing that is also so pretty, that is to say that glistens and is so silvery. Another of the security-related pieces that Lou and her team worked on is this one, Cell, from 2004-2006, based on a death row cell in an American prison. So given the subject, it's necessarily kind of barren and monochrome and cold-looking. She said, quote, "It's another iconic American symbol that we don't think a lot about," unquote, which is probably true, and very political, obviously, in that sense. While creating it, she said, Lou thought about the process of serving time, as in a prison, but also the time needed to carefully make, because this is totally beaded also, to make a work like this. And she actually encouraged her team members to work as slowly as possible, which may seem a little strange. But she was particularly interested, she said. She looked at, for example, the beads, the bricks, if you look at them closely. She said she considered each brick a separate abstract painting. And when she looked at the floor, again, this is supposed to be concrete, but of course it's again beads, that again, those patterns, which are remarkably intricate, she also considered separate abstract paintings. So it's the aesthetic aspect of her work is very much there, even though it may not always be the first thing that comes to mind. More and more then, Liza Lou began making sculptures with fewer colors and working with more and more sober subject matter, which again seemed very different from her work, certainly from the 1990s. Religion came to the fore again in her series inspired by Islamic prayer rugs, which she started in 2007. So, that's an actual prayer rug, of course, characterized naturally by lots of abstract, very rich colors and forms, and usually with an area, a niche that points the worshiper toward Mecca. So she wasn't literally remaking prayer rugs, but she's making things that were very much like them, rug-like sculptures that she made with her team, which of course are beaded, and combine her usual rigorous adherence to grids and to a certain amount of perfection, but with intentional imperfections, areas where it looks like the rug has been invaded by some foreign substance, by mold or blood or tar or insects, or where it seems to be unraveling. Just really quickly to show you an example, offensive defensive from 2008, which looks, this is not a flaw on the slide, that's intentional. So black beads that looks like it's been scarred and put back together. Or another one, Axis to Feet, with obviously military implications, where again you seem to see blood, coming and flowing from the beads. Well, of course, they are the beads. In another way. And if we get a little closer, you can see them working on this. So these are large projects. And if you get closer, you can see, again, it really is beads. And more than that, they're beads now that are not threaded the way the blades of glass were. Rather, they are balanced on their tips, which is another whole process that she talked about and gets to be very complicated as a technique. Again, she says she always likes to choose the most impossible way to make something, and she does. I mentioned earlier that although Lou's art is clearly identifiable usually as hers, she nevertheless does create work with definite and intentional references, or at least parallels, to the work of a wide variety of other very different artists. Just really quickly, just to give you an idea of what I'm thinking about here. For one thing, one obvious resonance that Lou's sculpture has is with the so-called pattern and decoration movement, which had kind of a brief but nonetheless noteworthy moment in the sun, in American art in the 1970s and 80s especially. And as the name implies, the pattern and decoration movement encompassed a wide array of artworks, mainly created by women. And two good examples might be, for example, Miriam Shapiro's gaily decorated, and not always gaily decorated, but decorated fan series, or Joyce Kosloff's mosaics. If you haven't noticed this, it's at One Penn Center right here in Philadelphia, because it's the train connection, suburban station. You have to go in the right door, but it is there. And this enthusiastically anti-minimalist approach, I think it's fair to say, again, was sadly much undervalued. That is, pattern and decoration art was undervalued by much of the art world at the time, partly, I think, because it was created by women, but largely, I think, because it was too close to craft, and again, too colorful, too shiny to be taken seriously. Liza Lou can also be seen as part of another group of American women artists who, over the last quarter century, have produced works which, while not part of pattern and decoration, similarly explored the seductive power of using non-fine art materials and lots of colors. So, for example, related to works by people such as Faith Ringgold and her wonderful story quilts, the ironic samplers that are hand-stitched by Elaine Reichek, or as you probably know if you've been coming to PAFA, the amazing Rina Banerjee and her, in this case, her hot pink Taj Mahal, which is quite extraordinary, as is all of her work, I think, and certainly is about as highly decorated as it's possible for anything to be. But I don't want to just mention women. There were some other male artists besides Longo that whose work rather has interesting parallels with her. For example, on the left, as you see, that's a stack of what look like sheets of white paper with rough edges. They're actually all beaded cloths made to look like pieces of white paper. I'm comparing it on the right to Felix González Torres, one of his many stacked pieces. In his case, they actually are pieces of paper. And of course, the big difference is that unlike what Liza Lou does, because you're not supposed to touch Liza Lou's art, of course, but you are supposed to not just touch, but take away pieces of paper from González Torres. And that's related to Liza Lou's Book of Days, which obviously has another kind of religious, potentially religious reference. So it's a stack of 365 Book of Days, right? So 365 handmade sheets of gold beaded cloth that kind of looks like paper. And I also wanted to point out, that's just getting closer. She says she really likes people to see the edges, because of course that's all you see. You don't see the 364 other tops, and you don't see any of the bottoms. So people have compared, for example, that's on her the left is her rolled up, huge, enormous length of beads, comparing it to an early work by Richard Serra, the minimalist artist there, 35 feet of lead rolled up. And certainly when I came across Liza Lou's 2018 series called Aggregates, you can see there are some of them that are like this. These are all beaded elements too, just kind of stacked on top of each other. And sometimes they're very pale in color, but sometimes they're very bright in color, which brought to mind, if you know, Jeff Koons' enormous Play-Doh sculpture, although of course his is made of polychromed aluminum. Anyway, quickly, I got a little carried away here. Liza Lou made many further experiments with abstraction. For some time, instead of covering actual or cast resin replicas of recognizable subjects like stoves or people with beads, Liza Lou has been further experimenting with abstraction, creating works that are solely beads, not made to look like anything in particular. And what I see as kind of a transitional work in this regard is Gather 1 Million from 2008-2010. Which is glass beads on stainless steel wires held together in bundles with pieces of hemp twine. It's 150 feet square, and it may not look like much in a photo, but I think when you get to see it for real, it again gleams like crazy, sort of like a rug, although of course it isn't. And it's actually based on something like, that's just a photograph of an actual wheat field, right? Which is what she's thinking of. That's her working on the piece. And if you get a little closer, you can see that what she had to do here was she and her helpers first sorted 9 million beads by color, so there are various shades of gold, threaded them onto 1 million pieces of cut wire, hence the name Gather 1 Million, divided them into equal wheat-like sheaves that were each tied together and tagged based on where they belonged. I mean, it's quite a bit of work. And it obviously calls to mind fields in the American Midwest, the theme of the harvest, and just the sensual explosion of seeing, so many gold-colored elements in a single work of art. But This is a much more abstract example that she calls a painting. She acknowledges it's made of beads, not paint, but she calls these her beaded paintings. It's called Midas because guess what? It's all gold beads. And it is woven gold glass beads. If you get a little closer, you can see it really is beads. And it looks very wavy and irregular, sort of like moire, you know, that silk that's treated so that it has kind of a rippled appearance. In her case, this effect is rather different, I guess, but it's especially clear, I think, I'm sorry, this looks kind of gray. It's a mostly white beaded painting with all kinds of different striations, and the point she often makes is, even though, remember, she used to work by herself, but once she started farming out sections of her works to various women who would work with them, you know, at home and with their friends, inevitably, you know, there would be smells, there would be oils, there would be things that got onto those beads from cooking from people's hands, and so they would be irregular, and people didn't necessarily have the patience with their kids running around, etc., to make an absolutely perfect straight line. So she learned to accept and then to celebrate the fact that there were marks of the human hand on some of these that are not sort of pristine and, you know, almost look machine made. They don't look that way, which kind of reminded me of, yes, there is a painting there, that is by Agnes Martin, her monochromatic oil on linen paintings, which are paintings with paint, which are also, though, based usually on horizontal grids. Here's another example by Liza Lou compared to a painting by Agnes Martin. And again, look, they're different. And of course, the one by Liza Lou is beaded, but there is clearly something oddly similar, though also very different, going on here. And finally, she says, rushing, we come to one of her most recent series, the Clouds series, which are, again, groups of rectangular beaded paintings meant to hang on a wall, as in this installation here. And from a distance, it kind of looks like a group of wrinkled, partly colored handkerchiefs or something. They are, though, woven sheets of beads, and their look changes a lot when you see them under different lights or from different angles. That series was first exhibited at the Sydney Biennial in 2018. It's described, quote, as 600 hand-sewn beaded cloths, which became Lou's, which became what Lou was doing here. She painted and partly smashed the beads, which she and her assistants had so lovingly put together to show the intricate structure of the threads underneath and to capture the texture of actual clouds. And you can sort of see some of these do have a lot of color, some of them don't. It depends on what example you're looking at. Remember, she was a painter first, so here she's bringing back some actual paint and bringing back the gesture of the human hand. There she is with a hammer. She literally crushes some of the beads that she's already put there so that you can see them the way you see them. And just an obvious comparison, perhaps, is with this, because obviously one of the most famous representations of clouds, in paint anyway, were made by the British artist John Constable in 1822. His, again, are oil paint, of course. And she was certainly aware of Constable's paintings, but she says she was more directly inspired by the work of an amateur meteorologist named Luke Howard, who introduced originally the categories of clouds that we still use today, you know, cirrus and cumulus and so on. And so she said she was also strongly influenced by the dramatic thunderstorms that she experienced in South Africa. So there's just one of this series of clouds with more color that's visible. And you can see, again, it is beaded and yet also crushed. And there's one with a lighter palette. Okay, rushing to the edge here, sorry. These days, Liza Lou is married to this guy, Mick Haggerty, an award-winning graphic designer from England. She, looking more serious there, is now a financially successful and internationally known artist with galleries in New York and Paris and London. And she has works in the permanent collections of myriad prestigious museums and private homes literally all over the world. Her latest works, obviously, are very different looking from kitchen or backyard, where we started, and she often comments on the ways her life experiences, especially in South Africa, have changed her. And yet, as I said before, and as a number of critics have pointed out, in many ways, Liza Lou's art remains focused on many of the same themes that have been there from the very start. A focus on physically demanding, repetitive, grid-based labor, veiled or maybe not so veiled references to such subject matter as religion, feminism, politics, and poetry, and the sheer sensual power and allure of shiny objects. So again, I've never had a chance to meet Liza Lou, but I have to believe that her life and her art still focus as well on that kind of childlike joy thing that I think is what certainly attracted me to this work, which is what I saw first, naturally, that whole interest in fun. And I think you can see that very much in the last image. This is the 1996 postcard photograph that she sent to Marcia Tucker that attracted Marcia Tucker's attention and that got her that first museum exhibition and basically got things going. Thank you.